Thank you, Shane. Thanks for the introduction. And it's good to be back here at IGF-USA. I want to thank the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Planning Committee for putting the event together, and of course, thank GW for hosting. I've enjoyed having the opportunity to speak at this event. I think it started in 2009, and I think I've been to every one of them, at least every year that it's had been held. And I think there was a vacation year one year, a sabbatical year one year, and I'm amazed at the growth. You said you've got 600 some people registered. I remember the first one was in a tiny room, and I'm not sure there were even 100 people at the first session. So again, I think that is a testament to the great job that the planning committee has done, as well as the importance of all these issues. So when I look at your agenda for the day, it's pretty familiar looking because it mirrors our agenda at NTIA. But rather than devoting my remarks to any one specific issue, sorry, IANA transition fans, I'm going to use my time this morning to take stock of the multi-stakeholder process as a tool for addressing the key issues that exist in the internet policy space, and to reaffirm our strong support for the model in the work we do. Now, an appropriate starting point for these remarks is the ongoing work of the global internet community as it develops the plan to transition NTIA stewardship role with respect to the internet domain name system. And in testament to the success of the multi-stakeholder model, we're seeing technical experts, representatives of industry and academia and civil society, as well as governments, who are now working nearly around the clock to complete a transition proposal that meets the criteria that we've outlined. The work is tiring, it's contentious, it's often exasperating, and it's clearly not an easy task. But it is an important one, and I greatly appreciate the level of commitment and the effort that's being demonstrated by all the participants in the process. And most importantly, it is working, and I am confident it will be successful. And the effort is a compelling demonstration that bringing together all stakeholders, whether it be businesses, technical experts, civil society, government officials, bringing them together to resolve issues on a consensus basis is the best way to set the future direction of the internet. Over the past 20 years, the internet has flourished. It has driven economic growth, innovation, and free expression around the globe, and a big part of that success can be attributed to this multi-stakeholder approach to resolving technical and policy challenges. And it's not really hard to understand why this has been the case. Like the internet itself, the multi-stakeholder model is characterized by open participation and decentralized processes. The internet thrives only through the cooperation of many different parties, and the multi-stakeholder model reflects this fact by enabling a diversity of stakeholders to participate, fostering a diversity of opinions and ideas. The result is creative problem solving. It's nimble, flexible, suited to rapidly changing technologies, business practices, much more so than traditional regulatory or legislative models. But this is not to say that the multi-stakeholder process is easy. These processes can be chaotic, and they do require a serious commitment of time and energy from participants, but they have a clear record of success. The internet works seamlessly today because a cadre of technologists and policy wonks and others working in groups such as the Internet Engineering Task Force put their heads together to standardize voluntary programming languages, security protocols, and other web technologies. Stakeholders continue to update these standards on an ongoing basis. And think, if these technological challenges had been handed off to the typical Washington regulatory or legislative process to resolve, we'd probably still be waiting for the resolution. Worse, we might have technical protocols that are hopelessly out of date, hamstringing technologists and users from creating the robust, evolving internet we enjoy today. One shudders to imagine an HTML standard drafted by a government committee. And of course, we have seen the model work in the context of where the internet community has come together to resolve policy issues related to the internet domain name system at ICANN for the last 17 years. This system ensures that users are able to easily access the internet by typing in simple names like www.ntia.gov rather than confusing number addresses. So we know the model can work, and that's why we continue to embrace it as the best tool to meet our mission at NTIA to preserve and protect the internet as a platform for economic growth, innovation, and the free flow of information. This mission places us front and center in every major internet policy debate today, whether it be privacy, internet governance, cybersecurity, whatever. We're committed to making progress where we can ensure that our digital economy continues to grow and thrive. But at NTIA, we cannot do it by ourselves. We need you to come to the table, roll up your sleeves, and work with us to find solutions to these complex issues. In the next several weeks, NTIA will be kicking off 2 new multi-stakeholder processes. The first will tackle issues related to privacy, transparency, and accountability regarding unmanned aircraft systems, or what other people, normal people, call drones. Our first meeting is scheduled for August 3rd, and I invite any of you here interested in the topic to join us that day. Our second new process will focus on cybersecurity vulnerability disclosures, and it will get underway in September. And then third, we'll also be reconvening the facial recognition privacy process on July the 28th. In all 3 of these instances, the topics under discussion were selected after soliciting broad input from the community. As in any multi-stakeholder process, the community must decide when a topic is ripe for discussion and consensus in order for the discussions to be successful. We are putting our time and resources in the multi-stakeholder process because we know it can help build trust in the digital ecosystem. For the sustainability and continued growth of the internet, it's imperative that we preserve the trust of all actors on the internet. And the multi-stakeholder process has the ability to produce, in a timely way, meaningful guideposts for industry and consumers in this rapidly evolving technological environment. That certainly cannot be said for the legislative or regulatory processes in Washington. But as we continue to engage the community in these efforts, we're constantly reassessing how we employ the process. We welcome the community's ongoing feedback on how to improve it, and that's part of the beauty of the model. It's adaptable and flexible in the way regulatory approaches could never be. We are particularly concerned about identifying and reducing barriers to participation in these processes. For example, we have heard concerns about the time it takes to reach consensus. I grant you that reaching consensus on challenging policy issues does not happen overnight. In our first multi-stakeholder process on privacy, it took over a year to reach consensus on a code of conduct aimed at disclosures on mobile devices. But today, enhanced privacy notices based on this code are now live in apps used by 200 million people, and the numbers are growing. A 1-year process to make substantial progress on a policy issue impacting millions of consumers? Well, that's lightning speed in Washington. Complex policy issues typically take years to make their way through the regulatory and legislative morass of Washington, and most efforts end in failure. The few that do reach a conclusion inevitably solve a problem that no longer exists or has been overtaken by newer issues that themselves need to be addressed. Washington policymakers have struggled mightily to update laws impacting core technology policy issues, even when nearly everyone agrees updates are desperately needed. For example, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, ECPA, was enacted in 1986, nearly 30 years ago. It governs a range of key issues regarding communications, but it has not been significantly revised since its enactment. ECPA has created frustrations for law enforcement, judges, and advocates for decades. And all key stakeholders agree the law needs to be updated to take count of developments like the development of powerful mobile devices, widespread email use, and cloud computing that were unforeseen in the mid-'80s and are clumsily handled by ECPA. Experts have called for Congress to amend the standard of protection for online digital content so that it matches what's afforded data in the physical world. Proposal after proposal has been floated over the years, but despite the best of intentions, lawmakers have not been able to break the logjam and update a law that's sorely in need of revision. So in evaluating the time it takes to reach consensus in a multi-stakeholder process, consider the alternatives. They're no faster. Some stakeholders have also shared their concerns that multi-stakeholder processes are too resource intensive. Now, I understand that participants have to pick and choose their battles. Meetings can be lengthy, and some participants have spent countless hours working through documents related to these processes. But we want to encourage broad participation in the three multi-stakeholder efforts that will be proceeding on parallel tracks this summer. And we would suggest that to those companies that find it hard to attend all of these events, to find a way to pool their resources with other like-minded organizations to lighten the load of direct participation. But as with the concern about the time the process takes, some of these concerns may simply reflect that it takes some time to acclimate to this new style of dealing with policy issues. Our processes are still less burdensome than working through regulatory proceedings or preparing for litigation. Every important proceeding at the FCC attracts thousands of pages of comments, which then require hundreds of hours for participants to read and digest and then prepare their own filings. But they're used to that process and perhaps do not question it the same way they might our new and less familiar process. But in evaluating the resources it takes to reach consensus in a multi-stakeholder process, consider the alternatives. They are no less burdensome. Nonetheless, we want to improve our process. If the community feels it takes too long and uses too many resources, perhaps we need to ask ourselves, are we setting the bar too high for consensus agreement? At the outset of each process, we need a shared understanding of consensus. Should the stakeholder community consider whether a rough consensus is good enough in some instances? When stakeholders reach a point of exhaustion where they have come to a place that the output could be operationalized in the marketplace and then later modified and improved upon, maybe it's time to press pause and move forward. In the ITF, stakeholders often commit themselves to rough consensus and running code, and there might be a lesson there for our stakeholder engagements. But at the end of the day, we're going to leave it up to the community to decide when the work is done. And we look forward to your input on that issue as our multi-stakeholder work starts up or resumes later this month. The last aspect of the multi-stakeholder process I will address is also perhaps the toughest. For these efforts to succeed, we need players to come to the table with open minds, committed to collaborating fully in reaching an outcome. Everyone needs to be committed to reaching a consensus outcome and be willing to compromise to achieve that goal. Now, unlike legislative and regulatory proceedings where a strategy of participants may simply be preserve the status quo, that approach will not work in a multi-stakeholder process. And I want to suggest that that strategy of accepting the status quo as an outcome of discussions on internet policy issues we face today is not a strategy for success for your company or organization. Just as the internet economy is constantly evolving and disrupting existing business models, our policy responses also need to evolve. We cannot leave issues untended. We cannot live with the status quo. All that will do is slow down innovation on the internet and perhaps leave American businesses at a disadvantage in the global marketplace. Alan Deutschman's business adage, change or die, applies just as aptly to internet policy debates as it does to companies trapped in business models that are rapidly becoming obsolete. So where does this discussion leave us? We have to ask ourselves, are we better off playing the legislative and regulatory waiting game where progress perhaps never occurs? Or are we better off taking up issues and discussions where we might reach consensus on some issues? Are we better off with laws and regulations that are obsolete when they are passed or end up in a patchwork quilt of state rules and regulations, leaving millions of consumers subject to different protections depending on where they reside? Or are we better off with a process that is flexible and allows businesses to adjust in response to the rapid changes in their environments? I think the answers are clear. So I encourage everyone who works on internet policy issues to join in our multi-stakeholder processes. And when discussions get tough, as they inevitably do, double down to work past disagreements. Do not sit on the sidelines, observing but not participating. Multi-stakeholder processes work best when a broad range of stakeholders with differing viewpoints fully participate. And then most importantly, stay in the room. I realize that these multi-stakeholder processes collide with the culture of Washington. It's more comfortable and safer for companies to hire a team of lobbyists to work the regulatory agencies, lobby the Hill, and hire litigation specialists to represent their interests. It's how things have been done in this town for decades. But we're talking about the internet here. The internet has disrupted many entrenched industries, from newspapers to travel to taxi cabs. And perhaps it's time for some internet thinking by businesses to determine how to disrupt how business is done in Washington. Imagine what we could accomplish with the brightest technologists, policymakers, and academics who are committed to debating in good faith the solutions for our most important policy challenges for the internet age. And that's the promise of the multi-stakeholder model. So please engage with us, and thank you for listening.
Okay, he said he has time for a couple questions. First question, actually, I want to ask is, have you had to explain the multi-stakeholder process to the rest of Washington? Are they getting it?
Yes, I think they are. And I remember that when we first started down this road back in 2009, 2010, at that time, our press people were telling us, you need a new word for it because the newspapers will never print the word multi-stakeholder. So I think we've come a long way in the last 6 years because I think the term is now well used, often used, commonly used in the popular press talking about these issues. So I think that in and itself is a big advance. So
The only person I know who actually uses an acronym is Peter Dengate Thrush. You call it SMM. You have an MS, and I was like, why don't we all say that? We all stumble through the word. Do we have questions out here in the audience?
actually, can I add one other thing?
Sure.
So another interesting piece of this has been, at one point, I think back when I spoke at an ICANN meeting, I used the term multi-stakeholderism. And Milton Mueller came up to me afterwards and said, it's not an ism. Of course, since then he's used the term about 10 times, but I won't worry about that. But it was interesting that it had even gotten to the point where it was being used so much it was taking on these ideological, if not religious overtones. But I do agree with Milton, it's not an ism.
Steve, thank you for emulating our normal way of doing things here. At the microphone, go ahead. First question up.
Thank you, Shane. Steve Delbianco with NetChoice. Larry, NetChoice has participated in both of your multi-stakeholder processes, the one on privacy policies and also the facial recognition one, and we'll be there for the drones. We'll be hovering on the drone issue as well. But I wanted to applaud you and your office for sticking to it despite setbacks. And just recently in the facial recognition industry has had a point of disagreement with some of the privacy advocates, and it caused everybody to take a time out. But I can tell you that from industry side, we're working hard to get back to the table, bring the privacy folks in, find where common ground and consensus is. And that's endemic to this multi-stakeholder process that you talked about. But it is really hard work, and it's very different than the way we've always done things in Washington, where we take turns visiting the same legislators or lawmakers' office, telling them completely different stories. But when you have to tell the story in the same room at the same time and achieve consensus, it's harder, but I think it will bear out in the end that you were wise to pursue that track. So stick to it, and thank you.
No. Well, thank you for that comment, Steve, but I will just add that these processes yield the best results when everybody's there. We want everybody in the room, and hopefully we'll get back to that point with facial recognition, because if we don't, the process won't be as strong as it would otherwise be.
Other questions from the audience? Y'all are still getting your coffee? I think it's going to be up to several of you, and Larry, it might be you to give us the rough consensus idea that we can all repeat so we don't have to say that over and over again. And it's going to be something like, remember that time we were all in the family van and we'd had 3 days of Mickey and we wanted to go to Universal Studios, and you finally just said, that was rough consensus. Everybody but you wanted to go somewhere else that day. So we're gonna be looking for that example of how we explain rough consensus, which is everybody but one person, and then you're gonna have to explain how that gets through to everybody. No more questions. You guys are bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and ready for the day to start.
Coffee hasn't kicked in yet.
Oh, okay. Marilyn's going to the mic.
My name is Marilyn Cade, and I wanted to thank Larry and Fiona and her great team for not only supporting and participating in the IGF-USA, but also from 2006 all the way through before we launched the IGF-USA in 2009, your team came and participated in the preparatory sessions that we hosted at Becky Burr's office that helped us prepare to participate in the IGF. And you've also participated very, very actively in the IGF itself. Fiona Alexander, for some of you who may not know this, is a IGF MAG member and a very active contributor. It's really important, and I just want to thank you. Because the U.S. government participates so actively, that means other governments come and participate as well. And I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for that, Larry, because perhaps it's not as visible to everyone else as it is to some of us who only focus on these issues, that NTIA, as well as other agencies, have taken a real lead. So now here's my question.
Softens you up with a
Right.
compliment.
You're
Now
awesome.
she zeroes in with the question.
Given you've done so much, I want to look ahead to the IGF in Jao in Brazil later this year and ask you to maybe comment on what some of your priorities might be from NTIA for that very important session, as it is 2015. We're assessing the success of the IGF. Thoughts from you about what your priorities will be there?
I think the absolute top priority, and maybe priorities 1, 2, and 3, is to get it renewed and keep it going in future years. I think that's the pivotal question. And again, I think people who go and participate see the value of it and report that back. And you're right, we've seen an increase in government participation. And of course, that's helpful, since at the end of the day, it will be governments that vote on whether to keep this or not at the UN. But I think that's absolutely our top priority.
Great. Thank you. Any last questions? Not, if I can get Vint and Steve and Nancy to join me up on stage, we'll get started on our next stage. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.